Welcome, friends and foes, survivors and killers. Let's sit around the campfire together and talk about Dead by Daylight. Specifically, Dead by Daylight's newest killer, Adriana Imai, better known as the Skull Merchant. So the Tools of Torment chapter has been previewed, and to say the reception has been frosty could be considered an understatement. While the survivors Thalita and Renato Lyra have been received pretty well, and the perks they've brought up in the topic of some discussion, big fan of the 3 perks that encourage the killer to hard tunnel, by the way. By far the most criticised element has been the new killer, the Skull Merchant. Oh boy, people do not like this girl at all. Issues have been cited ranging from her visual design to her lore, and I'll be covering those in my more traditional lore video on the topic coming later this week or early next week. However, I felt it more important to get a video out now about a very controversial topic, while I still have time to get my voice heard during the window between PTB and live. Adriana's power, Eyes in the Sky, because it has not been received well at all. Long story short, it's shit. It sucks, it's doo-doo water, it's dog ass, it's dreadful, it's crap. Her power is not good, and many would argue is the worst power in DBD history. Although I know a fair few killers who might dispute that title, and while it's very clear to me that her power is not strong, I gotta say, I really like it anyway. For those who don't know, Eyes in the Sky allows her to place up to 4 drones in the map that act as little sentries for her, highlighting survivors who cross into their path so she can pick them up on her radar. Drones will deactivate after an idle period, but can be reactivated remotely or will reactivate if a survivor gets too close to one. When she's in a drone's area of effect, she gains undetectable, and a survivor who lingers too long in an active drone's area without disabling it will be exposed when the drone locks onto them after 10 seconds. Survivors can disable a drone, but if they do, a claw trap will attach to their arm that allows the killer to track them on the radar until it is removed. This is clearly meant to be a mostly surveillance power, with some stealth and lethality elements. But it spends way too much of a match doing very, very little. The drone's combination of setup time and lengthy periods of activity means they're not as consistent for information as you might like them to be. She has no chase power, and the fact that only activated drones hide your terror radius makes her stealth pretty lame a lot of the time. In effect, she spends a lot of the game having no power at all, and that's really, really sad. A lot of people believe the killer is an absolute failure by that metric. Her power is incredibly weak, and situationally effective, and believe therefore that she basically needs a day 1 rework. To put it simply, I do not believe this to be true. Yes, the killer is weak, very weak, and they do need some pretty significant buffs, but it's way too soon to call this killer a straight up failure. Remember PTB Wesker, PTB Pinhead, even PTB Blight? All these killers were kinda butt cheeks on their PTBs and got lots of buffs before live release. Especially Blight, who got an add-on pass that gave birth to the horror that is Alchemist's Ring. It isn't too late to see the Skull Merchant get the buffs she direly needs, and that's the purpose of this video. To offer some constructive criticism as to how to make the best of the power we've got to make the Skull Merchant the best that she can be. Let's start with figuring out what she's meant to be good at. She probably has the best base kit tracking in the game. Only really Artist and Doctor come close to that. Her power is versatile, at least on paper. Stealth, tracking, lethality, she should have everything a killer should want, apart from ability. But it's all too conditional, and as a result doesn't do its job properly. Let's look for a second at what I think is the most obvious miss in the Skull Merchant's kit. The stealth. On paper, the idea of creating a stealth zone to catch survivors off guard as you merge from your territory is amazing, and creates loads of opportunities to get the jump on survivors. But in practice it doesn't often work that way. Once you actually enter the drone's radius, the undetectable doesn't kick in immediately and barely lasts at all once you leave it, meaning you might only lose a terror radius for a couple of seconds. Pretty garbage as stealth power, especially because it only comes from activated drones, not scouting ones. This I kind of think is the missing piece to Adriana's puzzle. It's how she counters pre-running survivors, and can capitalise on leaving survivors injured by getting free hits as she emerges from her drone's control zones and forces those survivors to enter the control zones and disable the drones, so they don't get rich women jump scared while they're just sitting on a gen. Making the drones an actual stealth threat makes her more lethal and forces survivors to interact with the drones and claw trap themselves even when they're not actively in the drone's radius, kind of like a Demogorgon portal, which is sick and very cool. To that end, the first change I would make to the Skull Merchant is to make the undetectable linger for 8 seconds once you leave it, and have the undetectable kick in the second you enter a drone's active radius. This would make the drones a real potential threat the survivors have to deal with and keep on top of, especially if you can get from one active drone to another during that linger period to travel large areas of the map undetected. This is the biggest change I'd recommend, and it would actually give her identity as a proper territorial stealth killer, and would give the drones an obvious use outside of directly policing gens. In addition, I feel the exposure from locked on could do with a buff. Either decrease the time needed to lock onto a survivor, or increase the duration of the exposed. Both might be a little problematic, just creating guaranteed death scenarios on a lot of pallets and encouraging bloodlusting, but buffing one of those things wouldn't hurt at all to give her a little bit more lethality. There's one other significant thing I feel would make the dynamic territorial stealth playstyle work. But first I want to talk about her claw traps that get placed on survivors when they disable a drone. Ultimately, destroying a drone should be attractive for the survivors, but that doesn't mean the claw trap doesn't serve an important function for the killer, and they should really do a bit more than they do. I don't think in the current meta, the claw traps giving a gen speed debuff would be a healthy thing to have. But I believe a great way to make the claw traps a bit more scary would be to have the battery drain pause when a survivor is working on a generator. Make them actually have to go out of their way to get rid of it if they don't want the killer tracking them on radar. And make the add-on that breaks a pallet when a survivor with the trap vaults it, base kit, to give the killer a reason to chase the person whose location they now know. Nothing too crazy, but it would give the claw traps a more tangible function, and that's always welcome. The only other thing I think I'd do isn't actually related to any one aspect of the power, but it's something I'm very used to talking about as a Twins player: quality of life. Because for a killer who doesn't really interact a lot with her own power, after placing it at least, Adriana has a surprising amount of unnecessary clunkiness. First of all, slowing yourself while holding out the radar feels like shit. I don't know why it needs to exist, but the biggest thing by far is the drone placement activation cooldowns. Why does this killer have a cooldown after placing a drone? It's like they gave Trapper overheat. You already can't place two side by side due to their spacing rules, so that isn't a problem. What harm could possibly be done by placing a drone and then immediately activating another one, or vice versa? Obviously having a cooldown on activating a drone makes sense, otherwise you'd just be able to keep all your drones at 24/7 and it'd be miserable. But if you're recalling and replacing them, I don't see why that has to share a cooldown with activating them. Since you have to move back to where the recall drone was to replace it there anyway, it'd waste more time than the cooldown at that point. It just feels so incredibly clunky to be unable to place a drone after activating another one. I don't see why this has to exist either. I just don't get it. Allowing the killer to have more flexibility with controlling active drones gives more agency to do all the things I spent this whole video banging on about. Setting up routes to a generator with undetectable, defending an area with inactive drones, or using them in a chase to expose a survivor. As a killer with no chase power and no ability, Adriana Imai should be the last word in remote map control, and right now she's just not. So let's change that. Despite my irritation at how weak her power is, I really do like the Skull Merchant, I truly do. Micromanaging resources, controlling the map, splitting up pressure, this is my kind of killer. And I just want her to actually be somewhat good. If you're worried that all these buffs are suggesting are going to make the dreaded Skull Merchant 3 gens unbearable, have you considered we could just nerf Call of Brian and Overcharge so that games aren't effectively held hostage by these 3 gen perks that are obnoxious on every killer in the game, not just her? Like, I don't get the criticism that, oh, she's just another 3 gen killer, when every single killer in DBD is a 3 gen killer these days. Having a go at her because she's at her best with 3 gen perks is like blaming a running tap for your floor being wet during a fucking tsunami. People don't complain about Wesker being badly designed because he works well with gen kick perks, as my good friend Scooty Booty demonstrated in this video it's playing right now, so I don't know why some people are so terrified of buffing the Skull Merchant. Kill the gen kick meta, please. It is ruining the way the devs balance this game. In short, I really like the Skull Merchant. I really properly do. and you'll learn more about why when I talk about her lore next time. But for now, she does need some buffs. Not a rework, just some nice clean buffs that give her a proper gameplay identity and allow more tactical decision making and build and playstyle diversity on the killer's part. I think she's cool, but I know she could be better. And in case you've forgotten, a brief summary of my proposed change list. Undetectable becomes instant once you enter a drone's radius and lingers for 8 seconds once you leave it. Some smallish buff to lock on. The Palo Break add-on for the claw traps becoming base kit. Claw trap batteries not deplete when the user is on generators. Removing the slow when using radar, and last but not least, removing the cooldown for placing drones. The only cooldown she needs is between activating inactive drones. I firmly believe the Skull Merchant is not just salvageable with some buffs and quality of life changes, but potentially one of DBD's most interesting and unique killers. A fresh take on the trap killer formula, sacrificing lethality for more dynamic map control and stealth potential. This is a killer I really want to play more of, but I also want them to be at least decent. Maybe with these buffs, Adriana can be received on live with the warm reception I believe she deserves.